Imagine you are a farmer. You have rough hands, worn boots, and a spear that you probably made yourself. You have never been to war school. You have never trained in a castle courtyard with professional soldiers. You don't own a horse, you don't own armor, and you certainly don't own anything that resembles a military budget. Now imagine that standing on the other side of the valley, staring directly at you, is one of the most powerful and well-funded armies in all of medieval Europe. We're talking thousands of heavily armored knights, professional soldiers, men who have trained their entire lives for this one moment, crushing people like you into the dirt. And here's what's wild: you win, not just survive, you absolutely decisively, humiliatingly destroy them. That is the story of Näfels. And once you understand how it happened, you'll never look at the word underdog the same way again. Welcome back to From Start to Now. Today we are going back to April 9, 1388, to a small valley in what is now Switzerland, where a handful of mountain communities pulled off one of the most jaw-dropping military upsets in the entire Middle Ages. This isn't legend, this isn't myth, this is documented, studied, and still remembered, with a celebration every single year in the canton of Glarus. So let's get into it, because the story of how it started is just as fascinating as how it ended. To understand Näfels, you have to understand the world it came from. In the late 1300s, Central Europe was a very complicated place politically. The Holy Roman Empire was this enormous, loosely connected patchwork of territories, princes, bishops, and city-states, all constantly jostling for power and territory. And sitting right in the middle of some of the most strategically important mountain passes in all of Europe were these small, stubborn communities of Swiss peasants and herdsmen who had spent decades quietly building something remarkable: a confederation, not an empire, not a kingdom, just a group of free communities who had made a promise to one another that if anyone came after one of them, they would all show up together to fight back. This Swiss Confederacy, as historians call it, had started small. A few forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, had made that original pact back in the late 1200s, and over the decades more communities had joined. By 1388, the Confederation included places like Lucerne, Zurich, Zug, Bern, and the canton of Glarus. And this expansion was not sitting well with their neighbors, particularly the House of Habsburg. If that name sounds familiar, it's because the Habsburgs were one of the great dynasties of medieval and early modern Europe, rulers of vast territories, extraordinarily wealthy, and deeply invested in controlling the Alpine passes and the communities that sat on top of them. The Swiss Confederacy was basically a direct challenge to Habsburg authority, and challenges like that in the 1300s tended to end in blood. The relationship between the Habsburgs and the Swiss had already produced some legendary battles. In 1315, at the Battle of Morgarten, Swiss fighters had ambushed a Habsburg force in a narrow mountain pass and essentially massacred them. In 1386, just 2 years before Näfels, came the Battle of Sempach, where the Swiss Confederacy defeated another major Habsburg army so decisively that Duke Leopold III of Habsburg was killed on the field. That was a massive blow, not just militarily, but symbolically. The Habsburgs had lost their duke, they had lost prestige, and in medieval politics, prestige was everything. So by early 1388, the Habsburgs were in a complicated spot. They were politically humiliated, they had grieving nobles who wanted revenge, and they were still very much a powerful force, looking for a way to reassert themselves. And that brings us to Glarus. Glarus was a small canton, a mountain valley community that had joined the Swiss Confederacy in 1352. Its people were farmers, herders, craftsmen, not warriors by profession. The total population of the entire canton was modest by any measure, but Glarus had been an active participant in the Confederation's conflicts, and the Habsburgs had not forgotten that. In the opening months of 1388, Habsburg-aligned forces began making moves against Glarus specifically. They raided, they applied pressure, and the situation was escalating fast. Now here is where the story takes the specific shape that makes it so extraordinary. In early April of 1388, a Habsburg military force assembled and began moving toward Glarus. And when we say Habsburg military force, we need to pause and appreciate what that actually meant. This wasn't a rough collection of farmers with pitchforks. This was a proper medieval army. Cavalry, armored, knights, professional infantry, men with equipment and training and the full financial backing of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Various sources put the Austrian force at somewhere around 5,000 to 9,000 men, though exact numbers in medieval warfare are always debated. What isn't debated is that they absolutely, drastically outnumbered the defenders. The Glarus forces that would face them numbered somewhere around 600 men initially. Some sources stretch this to perhaps a few hundred more, but the core fighting force was tiny. Even with reinforcements that would arrive later from other parts of the Confederation, the Swiss total on that day was still somewhere around 2,000 men at most, facing an army at least twice that size, and arguably much larger. So how do you win that fight? You don't fight it fair. That's how. The Swiss defenders of Glarus understood something that pure military textbooks rarely teach, but every great guerrilla commander throughout history has understood: the terrain is a weapon. And they lived in some of the most dramatic, most brutal, most tactically complex terrain on the entire European continent. The Alps aren't just pretty mountains. They are a series of death traps for anyone who doesn't know them. Narrow valleys, sudden elevation changes, passes that look open but funnel into choke points, slopes that are invisible from below until you're already standing on them looking down. For the people who grew up in these mountains, who herded livestock across them, who knew every rock and every ridge, this landscape was not an obstacle. It was an ally. The Austrian force entered the Glarus Valley with the kind of confidence that comes from having overwhelming numbers and superior equipment. Their plan was straightforward in the way that powerful armies' plans usually are: advance, overwhelm, conquer. What they did not fully account for was the fact that the Swiss defenders had chosen their ground very carefully. The fighting would take place near the village of Näfels, in a section of the valley where the terrain created natural constraints on how a large force could move and deploy. Now, before the main engagement, there was an important preliminary moment. The small Glarus force didn't just sit and wait for the Austrians to arrive in full. They conducted an aggressive forward defense, essentially engaging the advancing Austrian force earlier and at the edges, doing damage and then falling back strategically. This wasn't recklessness. This was deliberate, calculated harassment designed to do several things at once. First, it slowed the Austrian advance. Second, it inflicted real casualties even before the main battle. And third, and this is the psychologically clever part, it potentially created a sense of momentum and overconfidence in the Austrian commanders. When you're a large, powerful army and a much smaller force is engaging you and then retreating, there is a natural human tendency to assume they are breaking, to push harder, to chasing in a mountain valley where the defenders know every inch of the ground and you don't, is a very dangerous thing to do. The Glarus fighters retreated through terrain they knew perfectly, drawing the Austrian force deeper into the valley, tighter into the constraints of the landscape. And then, and this is where the real genius of the day reveals itself, the terrain and the fortifications came into play. The Swiss had prepared defensive positions, including what some sources describe as a series of barriers and obstacles along the valley route. Stone barricades, natural choke points deliberately enhanced, positions from which a small number of defenders could hold a much larger force. This kind of preparation tells you something profound about the mentality of these fighters. They weren't just brave. They were thinking. They were engineers of the battlefield, before the battlefield even existed. When the Austrian army pressed forward into the tighter sections of the valley, the dynamics of the battle began to shift in ways their commanders had not anticipated. A large cavalry force, which was the most powerful military asset of the medieval period, the thing that made wealthy armies so terrifying, becomes deeply problematic in confined terrain. Horses need space to maneuver, to charge, to deploy effectively. In a narrow Alpine valley with rough ground, stone obstacles and slopes on multiple sides, cavalry loses most of its advantages. The Swiss infantry, fighting on foot with halberds, spears, and the kind of ferocious determination that comes from defending your actual home, was suddenly not so outmatched. And then the reinforcements arrived. This is the detail that completes the picture and turns a desperate defense into a rout. While the Glarus fighters had been holding and harrying and drawing the Austrians into unfavorable ground, messages had gone out to Confederation allies, and fighters from neighboring communities began arriving. From Schwyz most significantly, marching hard through the mountains to reach Glarus in time. When these additional Swiss forces arrived and entered the battle, the already struggling Austrian army found itself hit from positions they hadn't fully accounted for. The coordination between the Glarus locals and their Confederation reinforcements, achieved without modern communication, in difficult terrain, under the pressure of an active military engagement, is genuinely remarkable. The Austrian force, which had come into the valley expecting a swift conquest, now found itself in a nightmare scenario. Too large to maneuver effectively, pressed into terrain that neutralized their advantages, facing opponents who knew every inch of the ground and fought with the intensity of people protecting their families and their freedom, and suddenly confronting unexpected reinforcements appearing from directions they hadn't fully controlled. The battle turned into a catastrophe for the Habsburgs. The numbers tell the story starkly. Estimates of Austrian dead at Näfels range from around 500 to nearly 2,000, an absolutely devastating toll for a single engagement. The Swiss losses, by contrast, were remarkably light. Various sources put Confederation deaths at somewhere between 50 and a few hundred, a small fraction of the opposing losses. For the Austrian force, this wasn't just a tactical setback, it was a collapse, a rout. Men who had arrived expecting easy victory were fleeing the valley, and those who couldn't flee were dying. Among the dead on the Austrian side were dozens of the noble and knightly class, men whose names and coats of arms were later recorded, because in medieval warfare the deaths of noblemen were the deaths that got written down. This matters because it tells us the Austrian force wasn't holding back their best fighters. The knights were in it, the professional soldiers were in it, and they lost to farmers and herders and craftsmen who understood their mountains better than any army could be trained to understand them. Now, let's take a breath and think about why this matters beyond just the tactics. Because the Battle of Näfels is more than a military story. It's a story about what happens when a community refuses to accept the narrative that power is only held by the powerful. In the medieval world, the social order was more or less built on the assumption that knights won wars. That's why knights existed. They were expensive to train and equip precisely because they were supposed to be decisive on the battlefield. The entire feudal system had a kind of military logic baked into it. The nobility ruled partly because they were supposed to be the ones who could fight, who could protect, who could project force. When peasants and farmers and mountain communities started consistently deaf, eating heavily armored knights on the battlefield, not once, not twice, but repeatedly across decades of Swiss military history, it was doing something to the underlying logic of medieval European society. It was demonstrating in the most concrete possible way that the equation wasn't as simple as it had seemed. Morgarten in 1315, Lopen in 1339, Sempach in 1386, and now Näfels in 1388. Each of these battles was a Swiss victory over numerically comparable or larger and better equipped forces. Each one added to a growing body of evidence, not just for the Swiss themselves, but for observers across Europe, that the way war worked could be different from what everyone had assumed. The Swiss became famous, their military reputation spread. By the 1400s and into the 1500s, Swiss mercenaries would be among the most sought-after soldiers in Europe, hired by kings and popes, because their effectiveness was so well established. That reputation was built on battles exactly like Näfels. But there's another layer to this story that I want to make sure we don't skip past. because it goes beyond the military history into something about identity and memory. After Näfels, the people of Glarus established a tradition. Every year on the first Thursday of April, they would hold a commemorative procession, the Näfels, walking the route of the battle, stopping at the places where the fighting happened, remembering the names of those who died. This tradition has continued, with some interruptions, for over 600 years. 600 years. There are very few traditions in the world that are still practiced. The fact that this one survived tells you how deeply the battle embedded itself into Glarus identity, and think about why that would be. For a small community, a community that by any external measure was not supposed to win that day, the victory at Näfels wasn't just a military success. It was proof that they existed, that they mattered, that their autonomy was real and defensible, and worth the cost. In a world where small communities were constantly being absorbed, dominated, or erased by larger powers, Näfels was the moment when Glarus said to the Habsburgs, and to anyone else watching, "We are still here, and we will still be here tomorrow." The broader political fallout from Näfels was significant too. Combined with the earlier defeat at Sempach in 1386, the Battle of Näfels effectively forced the Habsburgs to reassess their strategy with respect to the Swiss Confederacy. The Peace of 1389, sometimes called the Peace of Zurich, formalized a ceasefire between the Habsburgs and the Swiss Confederation that would last for 7 years, and it effectively marked the end of the most intense phase of Habsburg attempt to militarily subjugate the Confederation. The Swiss weren't done dealing with the Habsburgs. That relationship would remain complicated for a long time, but the era of large-scale Habsburg military invasions aimed at crushing the Confederation was essentially over, and Näfels was one of the final nails in the coffin of that strategy. It's also worth thinking for a moment about the Austrian perspective, because history is always more interesting when you look at it from multiple angles. For the Habsburg nobles and commanders who survived that day, Näfels must have been deeply disorienting. These were men who had been raised in a worldview where their position at the top of the military hierarchy was simply how things worked. Yes, Morgarten had happened, and yes, Sempach had happened, and those were serious defeats, but each time there might have been a temptation to explain them away. Unusual circumstances, specific terrain, moments of bad luck. By the time Näfels happened, though, that explanation was getting harder to sustain. The Swiss were just better at this particular kind of warfare, and the Habsburgs, like any sophisticated power, eventually had to accept that continuing to throw conventional armies at the problem was not going to produce different results. There's a leadership lesson buried in there that is as relevant today as it was in 1388. When your strategy keeps failing against the same opponent, using the same methods, at some point the answer isn't to try harder, it's to think differently. The Habsburgs, who kept sending conventional armies into Swiss mountain territory, were essentially ignoring the evidence in front of them. The Swiss, by contrast, showed extraordinary strategic intelligence, not by inventing entirely new technology or tactics, but by deeply understanding their own strengths and the opponent's weaknesses, and building a battle plan around that understanding every single time. And the strengths of the Swiss weren't mysterious or exotic. They were completely logical given who these people were. They knew the terrain because they lived in it. They were physically strong and hardy because their lives demanded it. They were motivated in a way that professional soldiers fighting for pay could never quite match, because they were fighting for their homes, their families, and the specific freedom that their confederation represented. And critically, their military formations, particularly the use of the pike and halberd in tight infantry formations, were well suited to the close quarters, confined fighting that mountain terrain produced. Every one of these advantages was a direct outgrowth of who they were and how they lived. They didn't have to manufacture an edge. They just had to recognize the edge they already had and use it. This is something that military historians call asymmetric warfare, though they usually use the term in the context of modern conflicts. But the concept is ancient. When a smaller or less conventionally equipped force finds a way to negate the advantages of a larger or better equipped opponent, that's asymmetry in action. The Swiss were masters of it in the 14th century, and Näfels is perhaps the clearest single illustration of how completely it could work. Let me paint the scene one more time before we close, because I want you to feel it. April 9th, 1388. It's early spring in the Alps, which means the air is cold and the ground is rough, and the mountains are still carrying their winter weight. The people of Glarus have known this fight is coming. They've prepared their positions, they've sent for help, and now they are standing in their valley, in their home, looking at an army that has come to take everything from them. They are outnumbered, they are out-equipped. By every conventional measure, they are supposed to lose. And then the Austrian force enters the valley, and the Swiss don't run. They engage and they fall back, and they draw the enemy forward, and then they hold. The rocks and the slopes and the narrow paths do their work. The cavalry that should be devastating is fumbling in the tight ground. The Swiss halberdiers, these farmers with long-handled axes, are in their element, close and brutal, and absolutely relentless. The reinforcements arrive, and the tide turns so completely, so decisively, that the great army that marched into this valley full of confidence leaves it shattered, hundreds of its finest soldiers dead in the Alpine mud, and the people of Glarus, the farmers, the herders, the craftsmen, are still standing, still here, just like they promised each other they would be. That is Näfels. That is the April 9th, that a small community stopped one of Europe's most powerful dynasties in its tracks, and in doing so, wrote their name into a history that has lasted more than 600 years. The next time someone tells you that size is everything, that resources are everything, that the powerful always win, remember this valley, remember these farmers, remember that on one cold April morning in 1388, the most powerful army in the region walked into the mountains and came out broken, because sometimes the underdog doesn't just win, sometimes the underdog wins so completely that the powerful have no choice but to walk away and leave them alone forever. If you've made it this far, thank you. Seriously, it means everything that you're here watching from start to now. If this story hit you the way it hit me when I first really dug into it, drop a comment below. I want to know what part got you most. And if you're new here, this is what we do. We take the stories that got left out of the textbooks, the moments that changed everything but nobody talks about, and we bring them back to life. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of channel, because there are so many more stories where this one came from. I'll see you in the next one.